Welcome to Better Than Ever Live. Wherever you are, wherever you're watching, wherever you're listening, I hope you're making this Thursday, making today your masterpiece. In this video, we're going to talk about visceral fat. We're going to talk about what it is, why it's so dangerous to our health, why you accumulate visceral fat, and ways to get rid of it. I'm Dr. David Geier, double board certified orthopedic surgeon, sports medicine specialist, and media medical expert. I help you feel and perform your best regardless of age, injury, or medical history. As always, please understand in this live stream, I'm not giving you medical advice. Everything we talk about is meant for general information and educational purposes only. If you have comments or questions about whether it's visceral fat and how to get rid of it, or the studies I talk about before that, I'd love to hear them. Leave those in the chat. If you would, leave your first name and where you're located along with your comment or question. If you have questions about the visceral fat and that kind of thing, I'll do it after the discussion because I don't want to sort of lose my train of thought and go down a rabbit hole. If there are comments or questions about the studies we talk about ahead of time, go ahead and leave those now, and I will comment on those as we go. If you have medical questions, injury questions, things like that, join us tomorrow, 12 p.m. Eastern Time for for Ask Dr. Geier Live. It's a version of Better Than Ever Live. On Fridays at noon Eastern Time, I answer your injury questions. So I won't do that here, but I will do that tomorrow at noon. One other little housekeeping thing, I'll try to remember to talk about this at the end. I will not be here next Tuesday. I am seeing patients at our Charlotte office part of that day, so I will not be there for Better Than Ever Live, but we will be there next week. I'll be here next Thursday for Better Than Ever Live and next Friday for Ask Dr. Geier Live. All right, I want to talk about our first study. We're going to talk about a topic that I'll do as an entire big topic in the coming weeks, and that is NAD or NAD+. It is a very common, it's all the buzz in the anti-aging and longevity world right now. It's been made popular apparently in Lifespan by David Sinclair and a number of other people. There's a doctor here where I am in Charleston that replenishes NAD through IV treatments for all kinds of people. It's all the hot topic. And it's because it's been shown that levels of NAD decline with age. And so the theory is if you somehow replenish NAD, maybe you won't age as quickly, you won't get the age-related diseases that typically happen. But there was a study that was just published in a journal called Nature Aging. What they did, these scientists showed that not only was NAD correlated with age, but also with physical activity. And basically, as you get older, if you're very active, you can have very similar NAD levels to young adults. Now, NAD, bigger term, not that you probably care, because I know I don't really care, but nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, it's important in energy production in the mitochondria. The mitochondria, as you remember from high school biology class, are the powerhouses of the cell. They create energy for the cell. NAD plays a role in that. And we know that NAD levels drop with age. It's been linked to a number of age-related diseases out there. Now, what this study did, they took a group of people, put them in 4 different categories. There were the young people between 20 and 30 years old. There were the older people from 65 to 80 that did normal amounts of physical activity. There were the older people, 65 to 80, that did above average levels of exercise. And then older people who were physically impaired, so they couldn't do any physical activities. And they tested all these different biomarkers, and they actually, in addition to just letting the people put themselves into those categories, the researchers actually measured their physical activity for 5 days to make sure they were in the right category. And what they found out, that normal adults and younger adults normally did about 10,000 steps a day, but the very active older adults, it was a lot more than that, about 13,000 steps. But what they did after that, a deep analysis, what's called a metabolomic analysis, looking at hundreds of different metabolites in the body. What they found is that NAD+ was most downregulated in the older group, so it goes down with age. We sort of knew that, but it sort of went along with that. But NAD did seem to depend on physical activity. Huge difference between, again, the people that had about the same amount of activity, but they were younger or older. The younger had significantly higher levels of NAD. But the older adults who got a lot of exercise, a lot of physical activity, had NAD levels that were essentially the same as the young adults in their 20s and 30s. So the conclusion was that most of our metabolic changes that occur with age, at least as it pertains to muscle, that we can reverse that by exercising on a regular basis. So that might be interesting. People are talking about, and we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, NAD precursors like NR or NMN. That's the really popular one apparently with David Sinclair. There's ways to stop NAD breakdown as a way to boost NAD levels. And then there are people giving NAD in IVs and things like that. So we'll talk about that coming up, but a very exciting way to be healthier longer and maybe live longer too. All right, one of the challenges that people have as they get older, especially women, is bone loss, osteopenia, osteoporosis. And it's really hard once you've lost that bone to sort of put it back on. So the key is to prevent it. Well, there was a study that was published this week in Advanced Nutrition, or Advances in Nutrition, I should say, looking at a specific fruit that can prevent bone loss. And what they did, they looked specifically at postmenopausal women and they typically have the highest rates of bone loss and the osteopenia and osteoporosis. What these researchers found is that for postmenopausal women at least, those who ate 10 prunes every day for a year had decreased bone loss. And even doing that for 6 months, they had less loss of bone mineral density compared to those who don't eat prunes. Now, question I guess would be why? Well, it looks like prunes have a beneficial effect on the gut microbiome. Go back if you want to know more about the gut microbiome. I did a show 3-4 episodes ago where we talked about it. But the prunes had a beneficial change in the gut microbiome, so there was less inflammation and less bone resorption. It led to less oxidative damage in the cells, the osteoclasts and osteoblasts that affect bone density. Here's the other upside of prunes, though, is that they can help with weight and fat loss. There was a study a few years ago that looked at eating prunes every day for 12 weeks, at least obese or overweight people. Just a small amount of prunes, they lost about 4 pounds over those 12 weeks, but they lost an inch off their waistlines. And we're going to talk about visceral fat and waist circumference. That's actually a big deal. And it appeared that it was getting better. So it may not be just, you only do it for 12 weeks. You could do it forever. The longer you take it, maybe the more weight you lose. I will be perfectly honest and tell you, I have never eaten a prune that I know of. I have never eaten a prune in my entire life. I have nothing against it. I know a lot of people sort of cringe when they hear that word. Maybe it's good. I have no idea. I just have never had a prune. Maybe I should start, even though my bone density is pretty good according to my last DEXA scan. So, but for women out there especially, that's something to think about. And the last thing I want to talk about today is what are called ceramides. So we know that type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease are the end results of a number of different metabolic changes. And we talk all the time about cholesterol levels, HDL, LDL, triglycerides, things like that. But there's a specific type of lipid molecule called ceramide or ceramides, which are produced when the body metabolizes fats that appear to be involved in how likely you are to get type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Basically showing that, and where this becomes difficult is there's all these, with ketogenic diets and eating lots of saturated fats, and does that lead to cardiovascular disease and some of this? And there's been a lot of back and forth about what's right and what's not right. But one of the concerns about high-fat diets, unhealthy diets, are the development of these ceramide levels in your blood. So this new study in Nature Communications shows why, especially with people who eat a lot of red meat and processed meats, the prepackaged meats, they seem to be at higher risk for diabetes especially, but also cardiovascular disease compared to people who don't. And it's because ceramides are one of the byproducts of eating red meats and processed meats. So what these researchers did, they took several thousand people over many years, looking for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and measuring the amounts of ceramides that were influenced by their diets. And what they wanted to figure out is, was it linked to red meat and that kind of thing? And what they found out is, look, we've got a lot of people that are getting diabetes, and it seems to be related to how much red meat and processed meats that they were eating, but it didn't seem to have anything to do with their saturated fats. It didn't seem to have anything to do with cholesterol levels. What it did seem to correlate to, the risk for diabetes in the people that ate a lot of red meat and processed meats, was their level of ceramides. That there's something, it seems to be, whether it's causation or correlation, but processed meat, red meat consumption creates ceramides, which then increase your risk of developing diabetes. And that in turn puts you at a higher risk for heart attacks, strokes, and honestly the highest cause of death worldwide, which is cardiovascular disease. Now, what this will be important for, not just explaining why some people that follow high saturated fat diets don't get cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but also it may serve in the future as a potential biomarker, something we can test in your blood to more accurately tell you the risk of cardiovascular disease. All right, so that's all of the early studies I've got. If you have comments about any of those, whether it's the ceramides, whether it's prunes, which I think are kind of funny, and the NAD, definitely leave those in the comments. Otherwise, I want to talk a little bit about visceral fat. I talk about this a decent amount in relations to other topics. Visceral fat is sort of the next evolution of the idea of obesity and overall total body fat as a risk factor for poor health. One of the challenges in the health world is using obesity, using total body fat as a way to predict poor health and disease-related complications. Basically, it's hard to tell, why do some people that are obese have a lot of medical problems, and then why do some don't? What is it about the types of body fat and the location of body fat that makes some people more at risk than others? And where this gets to, there's different kinds of, let's just say, abdominal fat. There's the belly fat, that what we call the subcutaneous fat that you can see, you can pinch that, but there's also what's called the visceral fat. That is the fat around the organs, around the liver, around the spleen, around the pancreas, around our intestines. And is it one versus the other that explains the difference between why some people that are obese have all these medical complications and some don't? And so again, we're going to separate belly fat, the subcutaneous fat, and intra-abdominal fat, the visceral adipose tissue or visceral fat. I'm going to say visceral fat throughout this. The technical term is actually visceral adipose tissue, but it's honestly, it's just easier. Now, how do you know how much visceral fat you have? Because again, you can't see it. The best test is what's called a DEXA test, a dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. Now that's what we use for bone density, but it's also the gold standard for body composition, lean muscle mass, body fat, but also showing you visceral fat. But that can be expensive and you got to go somewhere and do it. So sometimes indirect measures are ways to do it. And one of the best indirect measures for visceral fat is your waist circumference. Some of the studies we're going to talk about later looked at not DEXA scans to measure visceral fat, but they looked at waist circumference. Now, why is visceral fat so bad? Let me go through some of the problems, some of the health concerns that have been linked to visceral fat. First, and it's the one you have to talk about, and that's type 2 diabetes. Multiple studies have shown that people with more visceral adipose tissue have higher glucose instability, insulin homeostasis, insulin resistance that lead to type 2 diabetes. They've used CT scans to quantify the amount of visceral fat in people, and it's very closely linked to poor glucose metabolism, poor lipid metabolism. The higher people with higher visceral fats had higher fasting triglycerides, higher fasting plasma glucoses following an oral glucose challenge than the people with the same total body mass index, same total body fat, but more of it was belly fat, subcutaneous fat than visceral fat. So visceral fat is clearly linked to type 2 diabetes. Along the same lines, the abnormal lipids, and I see there's a question about abnormal lipids that I'll get to, Nazia, at the end. Visceral fat has been very closely linked to abnormal and what we call atherogenic, basically clotting and narrowing of the vessels, blood limits with a pro-inflammatory, pro-thrombotic profile. So we're talking about LDL, the bad LDL, oxidized LDL. We're talking about the dense small LDL, which is really bad for you. Decreased HDL, or the good cholesterol. The more visceral fat you have, the more likely you're going to have those bad cholesterols, the pro-inflammatory blood lipids. In theory, then, that increases your, not in theory, it does increase your risk of coronary heart disease and cerebrovascular disease, meaning strokes. The more visceral fat you have, you tend to have more triglycerides. The more you have lower levels of HDL, again, you tend to have normal or higher levels of LDL, but specifically the bad ones, the small, dense LDL, that is much more likely to cause clotting of those coronary vessels and cause myocardial infarction. Now, it's specifically as it pertains to visceral fat, it's the high triglycerides and the low HDL, the good cholesterol, that really increase your risk of coronary heart disease. And more along the lines of cardiovascular disease, we talk about high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, and the small dense LDL. That's sort of the atherogenic lipid triad. Certainly, there's another triad, not as well known, that's associated with visceral fat too, and that's high insulin levels, high levels of apolipoprotein B, and again, those small LDL particles. Middle-aged men with that triad, 20 times higher risk of coronary heart disease compared to the rest of the population that doesn't have those factors, and they're all linked to visceral fat. Last couple that I want to talk about, visceral fat's been linked to high blood pressure or hypertension, even in people normal weight, not overweight. But this is sort of like we were talking about earlier. We know there's a link between obesity and high blood pressure or hypertension, but not every obese patient has high blood pressure. But a study looking at waist circumference, again, an indirect measure of visceral fat, showed a very significant link to higher systolic blood pressures, higher diastolic blood pressure. So the more visceral fat you have, the higher your risk of high blood pressure. And then cancer, visceral fat, intra-abdominal fat, significantly increases your risk for colorectal cancer, regardless of your total body fat. It also predicts a poor response to chemotherapy and higher complication rate at the time of surgery. There are also studies that show that it's linked to breast cancer, both before and after menopause, prostate cancer for the men, and esophageal cancer. And then last, now this one may be surprising, but it's actually linked to sleep apnea. And you think, no, well, how is that? We think of sleep apnea, people have a lot of fat around their neck, and then they have all the issues that we've talked about where they wake up a lot in the middle of the night, they can't breathe, they're tired throughout the day. Well, visceral fat seems to be linked to obstructive sleep apnea. And it's hard to know exactly why, but people that put fat around their organs are also maybe more likely to put it around their neck and increase their risk for sleep apnea. Plus, with sleep apnea, you have reduced physical activity because you're tired all the time, you're not sleeping well, your appetite goes up because you're not sleeping well, all leading to more visceral fat deposition around your stomach and spleen and all that. And you get this downward spiral, more sleep apnea, less activity, eating more visceral fat, which it just goes on and on and on. So those are some of the risks with the health risks. And what I always care about, I talk about literally on every show, visceral fat is associated with a chronic low-grade inflammatory state. I care about it because that leads to arthritis, hip arthritis, knee arthritis, but it's problems throughout the body, problems in the brain like dementia, problems in the heart like cardiovascular disease. That visceral fat stimulates the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines, interleukin-1 beta, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, that just do damage at sites of tissue damage. They do damage to your organs, damage to your brain, damage to your heart, all bad. All right, so those are the problems with visceral fat. Who gets visceral fat? Well, it's been shown to be much higher in men and postmenopausal women. Basically, visceral fat increases with age, both in men and women, but especially in men. And that is one of the risk factors. Just as you get older, you're going to be more likely to develop visceral fat. But again, especially among women. Postmenopausal women, you go through menopause, have twice the level of visceral fats compared to premenopausal women. Now, with both of these, hormones are probably playing a role. In men, we know that testosterone levels decrease with age, and those lower testosterone levels may be related to the higher levels of visceral fats. When you look at ethnicity, Caucasians much more likely to have higher levels of visceral fat than African Americans. Asian and Indian Asians even more likely to have higher levels of visceral fat, even though their total body fat levels are lower than some of the other ethnic backgrounds. Another stress that you can control, because you can't control if you're male or female, can't control your age, can't control your race, but chronic stress or not being able to deal with stressful situations increases cortisol, has a prolonged activation of what's called your sympathetic nervous system, basically your fight or flight response, which leads to accumulation of more fat. So you may want to get your stress levels under control. And then certain foods increase your visceral fat. Fatty acid composition of your diet may play a role independent of how much body fat you have. There was a study back in 2014 in the journal Diabetes looking at people who overate, but they overate with either polyunsaturated fats or saturated fats, and then the researchers measured their visceral fat. Basically, these people were either overfed muffins, which were high in saturated fatty acids like palm oil, or they were overfed with polyunsaturated fatty acids with sunflower oil. They did that for 7 weeks, and it was, measuring all the different areas of visceral fat. It was the group that ate highest levels of saturated fatty acids that increased visceral fats, not the polyunsaturated fatty acids. We're going to talk about the Mediterranean diet in a second, but it's those high levels of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats in the Mediterranean diet that help you cut out your visceral fat. Polyunsaturated fatty acids, 3 times higher increase in lean muscle mass compared to saturated fatty acids. You eat a lot of saturated fats, you're going to develop more visceral fat. That's one of the conundrums with the keto diet. It helps people lose weight, but there is a lot of thought that it does increase the fat that you can't see around your organs, which leads to some of those health problems down the road. All right, so let's go real quickly because we've gone kind of long on this, but this is a really important topic. I think this is one of those things that people don't realize. It's not overall obesity that might play a role in your health. It might be this visceral fat. So how do you get rid of it? Real quickly, I just mentioned one. The Mediterranean diet has been shown in studies to prevent you from putting on visceral fat. If you eat the same amount of calories with the Mediterranean diet and other types of diet, the Mediterranean diet people do not develop as much visceral fat. Lower waist circumference regardless of their overall body mass index. Remember, that's the plant-based diet, fruits, vegetables, nuts, low proteins, but not as much red meat, not processed meats, and lots of olive oil is part of that. Another way to get rid of visceral fat, this is one you might not expect. Stop drinking soft drinks. Not just soft drinks, stop drinking fruit drinks. Drinks that are high in fructose or drinks that are higher in glucose significantly increase visceral fat. And it makes you wonder, is it the glucose or the sucrose or the fructose, or is it something else in it? Now, another way you could get rid of visceral fat, we talked about Mediterranean diet, we talked about giving up soft drinks and fruit drinks, you could take growth hormone. There was a recent study, it was a meta-analysis of a lot of studies that shows that giving people growth hormone decreases visceral fat, increases lean muscle mass, and is good on the lipids, the cholesterol levels and things like that. Another one, regular physical activity. That waist circumference, again, that indirect marker of visceral fat, is shown to be significantly linked to physical activity. The more physical activity and exercise you do, the lower your waist circumference, even if your body weight doesn't change. What that study showed, significantly smaller waist circumference, even though there was no change in waist in their overall weight loss, but also their cardiometabolic markers got better, which is definitely a good sign. So it gets a little tricky when you're talking visceral fat and the role of exercise and diet. They both seem to play a role. The question is it one or is it the other? And it looks like it might be more related to the exercise than the diet. Now, I would tell you do both. Get regular exercise, especially if you can get cardiovascular exercise, but also try to eat a diet low in saturated fats, more in polyunsaturated fats. But I don't know that it's an either or. My experience with patients, the more people exercise, they typically eat or follow a healthy diet. I don't have that many. I have a really active patient population, and yeah, I'm doing more orthopedic injuries, but I rarely see somebody that exercises a ton, even though some of the power lifters at my gym, if I were to find out what they eat, probably fall in this category. But rarely do people that exercise a lot eat a really crappy diet in my experience. But it looks like in terms of losing visceral fat that the exercise might be a little more important in losing visceral fat, even if your weight is not coming down, again, because you're putting on muscle mass. So I don't get terribly concerned about people's weights. I just want the body composition to be more lean muscle, less body fat. So aerobic exercise, the cardio exercise that I struggle to make myself do, but we should be doing more of it, including me. Balanced diet, Mediterranean diet especially. Whether or not you increase the amount of food you do, especially if you can not increase the amount of food that you eat, it's going to cause a loss of visceral fat. This is how it works. This will be my last statistic for you. If you lose 7% of your weight from exercise and a healthy diet, that's going to lead to a 25% reduction in visceral fat, and obviously a reduction in all those health markers we talked about earlier. All right. I don't know if there's a problem with the sound. I don't know, because it's all looking fine over here. What increases visceral fat? What causes visceral fat? I think I kind of went over some of that. What kinds of foods? LDL and cholesterol. So this is where there's a lot of debate with the ketogenic diet. Things like red meats are thought to have a lot of saturated fats. But again, people who eat a lot of red meat, some do develop high LDL levels, some don't. But saturated fats are typically going to increase your cholesterol, and especially your bad cholesterol, more than others. All right, there's the groin pain question. If you'll bring that tomorrow, we can talk about that. That is all I've got for you. I know that's an exhaustive discussion of visceral fat, but I did want to get to it because this is a big deal, and it's a topic that is not getting enough attention in health. We just talk about obesity, and the doctor will just say, hey, you need to go lose weight. Hey, you need to eat a healthy diet. They don't really explain why. They don't explain how. And not all obesity is as bad as others. And it's this visceral fat that we really need to be going after in all the ways I talked about. If you have any more questions about visceral fat and cholesterol and all that, leave those real quick. We'll talk about it. Otherwise, we're going to wrap it up. I think, and I'll have to check, but I'm pretty sure that I put the studies that I mentioned in this video. They should be in the description below. If not, I apologize, but they should be down there. If you do like live streams like this, information about health and wellness, recovery, healing from orthopedic injuries, whatever it is, so you can feel and perform your best regardless of age, injury, or medical history, subscribe to this channel. Click the bell to be notified when I release a new video or when I start a new live stream. If you have an orthopedic injury and you want to see somebody who really knows about those injuries, bone and joint injuries in athletes and active people, I would be more than happy to help. I'm a double board certified orthopedic surgeon, sports medicine specialist. I'd love to talk to you about all kinds of options, not just surgery, cortisone shots, physical therapy, kind of the things you hear from pretty much every other orthopedic surgeon. Go to my website, drdavidgeier.com, which should be in the description. Click there's a work with me and then a contact drop down. Go to the contact page. You can request an appointment. That way, information's in the description below. I've gotten 3 or 4 from around the country just this week, so definitely am excited to help any way I can. Remember, tomorrow, join us for Better Than Ever Live. I will answer all of your orthopedic injuries, your sports and exercise injury questions. Now I only do those on Fridays at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so join me for that. Remember, no show on Tuesday. We will be back next Thursday talking about supplements that you can take for osteoarthritis. That should be really good as well. Remember to subscribe to Better Than Ever Live wherever you get your podcasts. So if you can't join us live and you want to listen to it at the gym or on the way to work or on the way home from work, you can do that. So make sure to subscribe to the podcast. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to helping you feel and perform better than ever any way I can.